Hey guys, it's Saf here with another Raid Shadow Legends video. This video is a little bit later. It was planned to be last week, but it's been very busy at HH Gaming, and today we're going to be looking at the Hydra clan boss. Now this video should be going out the morning of Tuesday in the week that we think we are getting Hydra. We're not really sure whether it's going to be the Tuesday, Wednesday, and the highlights seem to indicate it would be a little bit later. But what I want to do in this video is kind of give you a bit of a step-by-step guide of what are you going to be facing, and how are you going to approach this encounter. Now, it's a very scary looking boss in terms of all the different new effects and new ways and new mechanics, but we're going to look at it and we're going to see if we can break it down for you. Now, as always, if you like this content, it'd be great if you could give it a thumbs up, and if you can subscribe to our channel if you want to see more of this content. It really helps with us generating this on a week-by-week basis, bringing you all the information about Raid to your screens. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the Hydra clan boss and see what is going on. So at HH Gaming, we have been writing a Hydra clan boss guide as news has been released to us through the various pipelines. You can see this on the website. It's under its own section, and obviously we are going to flesh it out as we get more information. Right now it kind of just breaks down the mechanics about what we know from the highlights. But what it does have, which is kind of helpful, is obviously there is a rewards page where you can see information on Mithrala Lifebane, and also a breakdown of the artifact sets and the mythical artifacts in terms of what they're going to bring. The main thing it has got is a breakdown of every single Hydra head that we know based on the information they provided to us thus far. So, the Hydra clan boss. Now, what we do know is this is going to be probably the hardest encounter that we've had to face in Raid Shadow Legends to date. I'm going to make some base assumptions about what we're going to be facing in the encounter, and I will sort of look at which champions do I think is going to fit the roles that we need to fill. So, the first thing to cover is the basic assumptions. So, I'm going to assume first that we need a strategy to cover every single head. So the reason why I'm saying you need a strategy that's going to cover all 6 heads, we know that you can decapitate a head. Once you decapitate that head, one of 3 things is going to happen, and we don't know the odds or whether what the stats are. We won't know that until we see the data. But right now, it's safe to assume that it's a 33% chance that it's either going to respawn the same head, or it's going to respawn head 5 that it isn't in the rotation, or it's going to respawn head 6. Now the problem you've got is, let's assume that the head of Torment, which applies a fear debuff to anyone who doesn't have Veil, is the 5th head, and you decapitate one head, great. Now you've decapitated the head of Decay because he was reducing your max HP, you had to kill it. Now the problem you've got is if that 5th head comes back and you don't have a strategy to deal with that fear, your run is going to fall apart very quickly, because anytime you attack that head with any form of ability, AoE, single target, you're going to get a fear. And that fear is true fear. And that fear is just going to be then ruin maybe your block buffs that you needed. Maybe it's going to ruin the block debuffs. Maybe it's going to not allow you to heal. Then your champion starts dying and your run quickly falls apart. We've seen it a lot with Bommel. It's a great example where one bomb goes off, the stun triggers to the next, and then it just becomes a chain reaction that you can't recover from. So I'm going to assume I need a strategy to cover all 6 heads. I'm also going to assume the boss is going to hit quite hard, so I'm going to need to protect myself. And as we know, there's lots of weird things that are happening via turn meter, so it's not going to be a typical clan boss where we can just put 5 champions in with specific speeds and hope for the best that it's going to work. We're going to need probably to build it like we first originally built clan boss, which is tanky teams, ally protection, enough healing, decrease attack, these sorts of strategies. I'm also going to assume we can resist some effects. So we know some effects can't be resisted, but there are many things that can be. Things like the stealing of the buffs, which we'll cover in a second. I'm going to assume that some of those things we can resist. And I'm also going to assume we can block things where it does not specifically state it cannot be blocked. The one big assumption I'm going to put up, and a massive disclaimer here, is what I'm going to cover is very dependent on the stats that we're going to face. We know for a fact that the Hydra heads have different speeds, just by the video that we've seen. However, we don't know how hard they hit, how much defense they have, how much HP they have, how much accuracy, resistance. None of that we'll know. So we can make some sort of top line strategies, but they may change a little bit depending on the boss stats. So let's cover the effects that we are going to receive on our champions. So I've not gone and broken down every single head here. What I'm going to do is just basically list every effect that all the heads can do. So we've got the Head of Torment that can apply fears, and will also increase its damage based on how many debuffs we have out, which basically means we need something to deal with the fear first, and we also need to keep the debuffs at a minimum, otherwise the damage is going to become unmanageable. The Head of Suffering will place a Weaken, and also places Pain Link. Now, Pain Link is basically kind of shared damage. You attack the head with Pain Link, you sort of deal damage. It's kind of like a reflect. Mischief is going to do a buff steal on the target with the most buffs. Now, this is where I was mentioning I'm going to assume that we can resist some things. Now, I'm going to assume that I can point that guy to a specific champion who I know at a specific point in time is going to have the most buffs, and then resist with just the right stats in my gear. Blight is then going to apply poisons and leech to us. Wrath is kind of the DPS head, I would say, of the Hydra, and he's going to do a decreased attack and provokes on us. And finally, Head of Decay, which I would say is the most lethal head in all of the combo, is going to be doing heal reduction and decreased max HP. So this seems like a lot of things being thrown at our champions in one go, but actually you can kind of deal with most of this in very simple ways. The Head of Torment needs a special treatment. We'll cover that a little bit later. However, the Weaken, the Pain Link, the buff stealing, the poisons, the leech, the decrease attack, the provoke, the heal reductions, all of those things, it doesn't say they can't be blocked. So block debuffs here is huge. It basically means you don't have to worry about those things if you can sustain it 100% of the time. Obviously, you need to keep in mind the Mischief head might steal some buffs, and that's something you would want to be watchful of. But effectively, I've heard some people say, "Oh well, I'll level Sigmund because Sigmund has strengthen, and I don't need to worry about weaken." You shouldn't be approaching that in that mentality. For me, you should be thinking, "I need strengthen to stay alive." Great, but the weaken I can just block. It's far easier to bring a block debuffs and deal with all of the issues than bring one champion just to solve one specific issue. And that's the key thing to Hydra. We're going to cover some of this a bit further down, but I just want to note that right now that don't panic when you see all these heads. It's the initial reaction, oh my god, how do I deal with all these heads? Firstly, you're only going to have 4 at one time, so you don't have to deal with all of them at the same time. You need to plan for the potential of all 6, but you only have 4 at one point. And secondly, these effects can be wrapped up into a single solution if you can make it work in your team. So the next thing we're going to cover is the things the heads do to themselves, the buffs they gain, the effects they gain. So the Head of Torment doesn't do anything to any of the heads. Obviously, they all have passives that reduce AoE damage, that do different things in terms of max HP and all that kind of stuff. We're not worrying about that too much, but the Head of Torment doesn't do anything. The Head of Suffering is kind of the tank, the protector of the Hydra. It does ally protect and reflect damage. Now, the ally protection is not necessarily the biggest issue here. It will be the reflect damage. If you have faced a War Chief in the Doom Tower, or if you have faced any of those the reflect damage buffs, thinking Ice Golem is a classic example, it's surprising how powerful that buff becomes when you're not doing it yourself. So you're going to want to either block it or remove that buff. There's nothing here that says you cannot remove these buffs. The only ones that you can't remove are Poison Cloud and Life Barrier, which we'll cover in a second. Head of Mischief is going to steal buffs off you and then spread them to his team on the next ability. So what you want to do is, either, again, block buffs, deal with that. Poison Cloud is a new effect, and it is a nasty effect. We will cover that in the next slide because it actually needs its own area for us to discuss that one. Wrath is basically kind of the DPS, as I said, he's the DPS head. He'll self-buff himself with increased attack. You don't really want him doing that because I think he's going to have magma levels of damage, magma level dragon, which is a lot of attack. And then finally, we've got the Head of Decay, who is kind of the protector healer, kind of a bit like that middle ground between a healer and a sort of a debuffer. He will be putting the life barrier and he will cleanse heads. And life barrier we'll cover in a second as well. So those are the things that the bosses do. Now, in terms of kill order, which heads do you kill first when you're deciding your battle? Number 1 is the Head of Decay. Any scenario. And that is because the Head of Decay does a passive where he will decrease your max HP whenever you heal, up to about, I think, 25%, which means you're going to easily, quite quickly, if you're running a two Hanorach, Doom Priest, Demitha, Immortal sets, it seems impossible for you to do this without healing. You're going to run into this problem. So the Head of Decay has to die first. When you kill the Head of Decay, you get your max HP back. You won't be able to run this Hydra boss at 25% less max HP. I think that's just insane. It won't work. So that is the first head that you kill whenever you see it in any rotation. The next head you should kill is probably the Head of Wrath. As the kind of DPS head, he has this counter which is Vengeance buff. Now, this Vengeance is going to tick up every time you hit the boss. And once it hits 15, it's going to trigger Vengeance. And Vengeance is going to give him a massive boost of damage. 300%. Huge stimulus of damage there. And it's going to AoE your team. So we obviously don't know how hard it's going to hit, but just by reading the description, it feels like that's something you don't want to do. So I would say he's the next thing to kill. And you might argue, well, I can deal with max HP, I can't deal with Wrath. That's fine, you can make that decision in your team, but those two I think are really high priority kills. The next one then is probably Blight, mainly because he does the Poison Cloud, and if you can't sustain a solution to the Poison Cloud, you're probably going to want to kill him first. And then really, it doesn't really matter the other three. I don't really think there's any major issues with the Head of Torment, Mischief, or Suffering. Mischief is probably the worst of the three, but you can kill these at any point in time. The Head of Torment is the lowest just because of the solution that I personally think is the best way to approach him. And it kind of makes him an almost forgotten head. So how do we kill the heads? Now, HP burn will work on all 6 heads. The Head of Blight will take twice the amount of damage. There are caps to all the types of max HP damage. That's in the next slide. But this is just a summary of the 3 main ways people normally deal damage. Poisons. 3 of the heads are immune to poison. That doesn't necessarily mean poisons are useless, because I still think having some poisons out on the other heads is probably worth it. But to note that Torment, Suffering, and Decay can take poison damage. Wrath, Blight, and Mischief cannot. Now remembering back to our kill order, Decay and Wrath were up there. So it means that one of them you're going to be able to kill with poisons, one of them you cannot. Note as well that Wrath, the one that has a hit counter, normally we would use poisons to get around things like the Scarab Shield or sort of on hit damage, Ice Golem's passive. We can't do that with Wrath, so we're going to have to hit our way through that counter. And finally, the other big thing to note here is AoE damage is penalized. Now I'm going to assume that the AoE effects in the passives are multiplicative. What that means is it's not 4 heads, 10%, 40% reduction. More, the damage will be reduced by 10% each time. Obviously there is one head, which is the Head of Suffering, that reduces AoE damage by 30%. So what that basically means is AoE is going to be either 34% weaker or 49% weaker, which means generally you don't want to use AoE. It's not a source of damage. Even Trunda is not going to be able to out-sustain that level of AoE damage reduction. And it's because it's a percentage as well, it's not like you can find other ways to manipulate that. It's going to be, hey, you're AoE in with the Head of Suffering, right, you're going to do half the amount of damage. The heads also have some limitations to our typical ways that we would normally do damage via passive effects, things like War Master, Giant Slayer, HP burn. So enemy max HP abilities, your Cold Hearts, your Calvalax would probably be the one that most people will consider here because it is AoE. That cannot exceed 10% of the max HP's head. Now, what we don't know is how much HP the heads have. If they have 2 million HP, you might find that someone like Septimus still does as much damage even though it's capped. We don't know until we see the max HP. Poisons will deal 90% less. This is a pattern on all of the Doom Tower bosses, even though Plarium don't particularly note them in their boss guides. Plarium, update your boss guides. Most of those bosses also have this cap of dealing less poison damage. HP burn is capped at 20,000 per proc, except for the Head of Blight, which takes double damage. Reflection effects, such as Brogni's Shield Reflection, specifically not the reflecting of the Giant Slayer, but the damage reflection. Those are capped at 50,000 HP, and then War Master and Giant Slayer themselves are also capped at 50,000 HP. Now, these caps make me give me an indication of how much HP the heads have. I would imagine they probably have somewhere between 1 million to 1.5 million HP. If we think the clan boss caps about 75,000, most of the Doom Tower bosses are somewhere between 2 to 5 million, unless they're a spider and they generally have huge amounts of HP. But I would assume it's going to be somewhere between 1 to 1.5 million, which means that enemy max HP skills are probably still not too bad. 100,000, you won't necessarily match your Turvolds or the ones that do just insane single target damage, but it would be pretty decent. What I do like about this is we are forced to now look at some champions that we haven't used for a while that are single target nukers. And it very much feels like your strategy going into this is pick a head, kill a head. Pick the next head, kill a head. And obviously when you decapitate a head, that head's neck will take more damage. That is going to be active for 1 turn. And when that head comes back, it's going to be on a damage reduction of 75% for 1 turn. Let's talk about things that won't work. You cannot perform any form of hard CC on Hydra. Stun, freeze, sleep, provoke, anything that would normally you would use. It's quite common with most bosses. You won't be able to use them on Hydra either. Soft forms of CC, where it's more conditional, true fear, fear, and the new petrification debuff, they won't work either. So you can't control the heads, that's the first thing. In terms of their skills, you won't be able to put them on cooldown, and you won't be able to apply block active or block passive skills. Again, this is very much in line with all the other Doom Tower bosses and other bosses in the game. Turn meter, as with dragon bosses, and I suppose the clan boss, you can't decrease the target's turn meter. So those are the things that won't work. There's nothing really that surprising here. It's quite common boss immunities. The one thing that is surprising, however, is that it doesn't specifically say you can't reduce the Hydra's speed. So it looks like decreased speed debuffs will work, which could be incredibly valuable depending on how fast they are. The other things that are obviously still going to work, decreased defense, weaken, attack, accuracy, crit rate, crit damage, the common debuffs that you would do to try and weaken the boss. Hex debuffs work, and including the Head of Mischief has its own mechanic about Hex that you need to be aware of. If you want to hit the Mischief head, you're probably going to want to bring Hex, otherwise it's going to be a nightmare to try and kill him. And the heal reduction debuffs seem to work as well, so that's an interesting one. The two main interesting ones here are heal reduction and block buffs. It doesn't state that they are not immune to those debuffs, and they're going to be very important for the next section. If you wanted to use bombs, you could use bombs, but I am going to say it right now, if bombs work on this, I would be very surprised, because I think the damage is going to be just too much for the squishy bomb champions to handle. Okay, so I mentioned we were going to talk about 2 specific new effects. The first one is Poison Cloud. So Poison Cloud, really the main issue here is it's going to convert all of your attacks to weak hits. You can deal with it in 1 or 2 ways. The first way you can deal with it, which is I think the way that they've suggested, is you use HB burn to almost burn the cloud. Now it does say you cannot remove the buff, you cannot transfer the buff, or steal the buff. And it has this phrasing in the highlights, which I'm not entirely sure what's the scope of what this means, but it says otherwise affected by buff manipulation skills. Now I'm taking this as I've applied the buff, now I can't do anything such as increase the duration, decrease the duration, or manipulate it in any other way. Nothing in there says you can't block the buff. I'm going to assume, although I would put an asterisk on this in, I can't confirm it yet, that you can block Poison Cloud, which if you can is much better than trying to deal with it in other ways. This is an effect you're going to need to deal with, because if you are weak hitting, all your other debuffs, decrease defense, decrease accuracy, decrease crit rate, decrease crit damage, whatever debuff, decrease attack, that is not going to work. Also dealing damage is going to be a major problem if you are weak hitting all the time. So Poison Cloud is probably the #1 thing you have to find a solution for when you're looking at a team. The next thing is Life Barrier. So Life Barrier is essentially a shield 2.0. It overrides the shield and the HP bar, and it will take damage for what you deal until that Life Barrier is depleted. If you manage to deplete the Life Barrier before the buff expires, then the head is stunned. If you don't, the head is fully healed. Now that is going to be a nightmare if you get to 5% and it goes poop back to the start. Again, it states you cannot remove the buff, you cannot steal it, and you cannot otherwise affect it by buff manipulation skills, whatever that particularly means. However, the boss heads don't state that they are immune to heal reduction debuff. So there is no reason why you couldn't have an AoE heal reduction or even a single target heal reduction on the person with a life barrier, and when that life barrier procs off, again, I cannot confirm this until I've seen the data, but the assumption I'm making here is I can just block the heal. Just like any other heal reduction mechanic. If someone wants to heal me, I got heal reduction, I can't heal. You could approach this and say, right, okay, I need to single target nuke this head, but what happens if that head is one of the less priority heads and you need to kill the vengeance head before it hits counter 15? You don't want to be directing your damage over to this life barrier in hopes of it fully healing. At the same time, you might feel that the life barrier is not important if it fully heals. It really depends on the situation. However, I would say you can just simply fix it by having heal reduction. And there are some very good team combinations where you're not punishing your team by bringing heal reduction. With all that information that I've just gone through, which is a pretty big chunk of information, how do we approach building a team? So I've kind of made some assumptions that I've covered that I could be wrong. Once I get the data, I'll be able to know for sure, and some of my things might change. But I'm pretty confident that the overall rough sketch of my teams here will be within this mold. So the first thing I'm saying is there are 3 essential things to your team that you're going to want to bring. The first one is a block debuffs champion. You can eradicate 70-80% of the boss mechanics by just having block debuffs in your team, ideally up 100% of the time, maybe having 2, depending on how you want to structure it. You might only need it up at like 75% of the time, but you need a block debuffs champion. I also think that a block buffs champion is going to be mandatory. Originally, when I thought of these teams, I actually thought about, instead of a block buffs champion, actually having a buff remover. Someone like a Harvest Jack that would reduce the duration, but we saw that most of the effects, actually, you can't manipulate them or remove them. So I think it's much better to just block them at source. And the next essential is either a Inquisitor Shamael or a Duchess. And this is because of the Torment head. He will apply a True Fear to any champion that attacks him that isn't Perfect Veil. And they made this change after they released the patch highlights. It originally said Veil or Perfect Veil, which would have opened up a few more opportunities. But the fact it's a Perfect Veil, there are literally, I think, 3 champions in the entire game that provide an AoE Perfect Veil. You've got Duchess, who provides it AoE unconditionally. You have got it on Rector Drath, who provides it AoE, but you have to be at full health. And the other one is Qui-Gon the Crowned, who requires your champion to have more attack. Now that's probably going to be very unlikely for most of the champions we're dealing with here, because they're support based, they're going to be having more defense. So in terms of bringing a reliable Perfect Veil, considering also that Duchess doesn't place it on herself, so she could easily get True Feared out of her own Perfect Veil buff, it's a bit of a nightmare. However, you can just bring Shamael. And we're going to have a special MVP page on Shamael because I believe he is probably the MVP of Hydra. Those are the 3 essentials. Then we've got some desirable roles. We're going to want a decreased defense and weaken because we're going to want to do damage. I've put decreased attack as desirable. It's probably more essential than desirable, but it basically means we want one of the champions that can provide those debuffs. We're going to probably want a Hex if we want to deal with Mischief. If it's not in rotation, you probably don't need a Hex, but if you want to hit that Mischief head, you need a Hex debuff in the realm. And then you want support champions, someone who's going to do ally protection, shielding, increased defense, healing, those types of champions. Let's talk about the MVP, Shamael. Why is Inquisitor Shamael my MVP for Hydra? He will remove any fear or true fear without a cooldown. Not place, not block, because remember the fear can't be blocked. It doesn't say anything about the fact it can't be removed. That fear, when you attack, will go, oh, I feared them, okay, never mind, cleanse. Once you've cleansed it, you get a 15% turn meter fill on that ally. It makes the Head of Torment just a DPS boss. It doesn't do anything else. He'll attack you. You don't have to worry about anything else. Additionally, Shamael is also one of the hardest hitting champions in the game. On his A2, 3-turn cooldown, as long as he has got 3 buffs out, he will ignore the defense of the boss completely. Which means you don't have to build him necessarily glass cannon, you can build him a slightly weaker damage, but because he's going to ignore the defense, he's going to do a lot of damage. The good thing about that A2 is it's really easy to activate. You'd think, oh, well, I need a 3 buffer. Well, put him in a Blood Shield. He gets 1 buff every time he attacks. You can put him in a Divine set to start with if you want, and then you just need to bring 2 other buffs with him. So it's very easy to activate him, especially considering we've got 6 champions now, so we can have 5 people to make that happen. Additionally as well, which is not really a big known thing on his kit, his A1 will have a chance to decrease the duration of buffs, and he will counterattack with that. So that basically means if there is an ally protection or reflect or those types of buffs that we kind of want to get rid of that have managed to make it onto the enemy Hydra heads, he has a chance to reduce the duration on a counterattack on an A1. He is the MVP of Hydra for me. He should be in every single one of your teams if you can get a duplicate of him. He makes it so much easier to deal with the Fear head, which can be a nightmare, I believe. Well, I think will be a nightmare if he does come into rotation, that head. You don't have to worry about Duchess timing everything. Shamael makes it invulnerable. And you also get turn meter fill, so it means you can go faster. It'll make speed tuning a nightmare, I bet. However, we're not really in that realm right now. Now let's talk about some other MVPs here. So I mentioned that you needed a block debuffs. I've gone through sort of all the different champions here. It's very hard to find champions that are not Void Legendary or Duchess of the World. So I've been trying to make this list not the Whale War or, well, it's alright, you've got all the big champions. I myself have not many of these champions on this list. So it's going to be quite challenging for me. What you're really looking for here is a champion that can regularly and reliably place AoE block debuffs. Blind Seer does it on a 3-turn cooldown. Also brings a backup revive. That's quite nice. Cardiel is probably very good. Lots of healing, ally attack, great buffs. Aura as well if you want him. Obviously, we've talked about Duchess being able to defeat the Torment functions. But she's also an amazing reviver. AoE, decreased defense. Like, she's probably, if you've got her, she's probably in your team, in one of them. I actually haven't included her in any of my 3 teams, purely because I didn't want people to feel that the team was too OP. But if you've got her, you're putting her in one of your teams probably. I think one of the MVPs for this is probably Underpriest Brogni. We all know how strong he is in Clan Boss and every other place of the game. He's probably huge for this as well. I'm very confident that Brogni will be in many teams. One person I'm very surprised has made it into this MVP is Minaya. Now, what I didn't realize about Minaya is that she has got a 2-turn block debuffs on pretty regular rate. I think it's about 4 turns. But she also has AoE heal reduction. Now, remember when I was talking about the different things that we would want to bring? Finding champions that can do multiple roles in one role is very powerful. So she's a very strong healer with a 40% HP heal. She's got AoE heal reduction, heal on her A2, continuous heals on her A1. I actually think she might be a very good champion for this encounter. I know a lot of people discredit her without Coronar or think she's basically a pawn for Coronar to be good. She actually might be very good for this encounter. We then obviously got some new Void Legendaries and some old Void Legendaries. Riho and Siphi would probably be gods here. I don't really need to cover it. Why? Because most people know that they are god champions. And then the epic that makes it onto this list is Scathix. Now, he was part of a fusion recently. He is a 4-turn duration, 4-turn cooldown, 2-turn duration block debuffs with a cleanse. So it's actually quite a good champion for this. So those are my MVPs for block debuffs. And I think you need to bring one of these champions or another block debuffs. There are plenty that do it on a 1-turn cooldown. A 1-turn duration. I've kind of avoided them because I think 1 turn is not going to be enough. You might be able to make it work with a buff extender. These are probably your best 8 at doing the role. Now, the next MVP I mentioned is block buffs. Not as big a list, unfortunately. However, there are some very, very good champions. There are some odd choices here. I'm going to cover the 2 middle ones first. Norog is probably a very good choice here. If you haven't got him in any of your teams, or if you've got him at 50, he might be one to bring up to 60. He's obviously got an AoE passive that decreases the damage you receive. Great. It's not as strong as Duchess, but it's pretty strong. But he has an AoE block buffs, and his book requirements are very low. You just need to get the A2 book so you can get it on cooldown. It's a 3-turn cooldown, 2-turn duration. Very, very powerful. Ugo is another one which is actually very good here. Epic, so it's reasonably accessible for players. Does eat a lot of books, unfortunately, but it is a A2, which is a 100% chance to place in decreased defense, and then it was a 75% chance to place block buffs. Now, the problem with her tended to be that she needed a certain number of enemies for it to work. Now, with Hydra, there's always going to be 4 enemies up, which means that's always going to be 100%. That is a 3-turn cooldown with a 2-turn duration. She is going to be in your team if you've got her. And if we assume block buffs is working like we expect it to. She also brings an A1 leech, so you can target specific head that you're picking on, put a leech on there, get some healing as you go. And a weird backup revive mechanic I don't think is ever going to work, but it is a strong cleanse to remove any heal reduction. One of the heads places heal reduction. She can cleanse that and give you a bit of a heal back. So I think generally a great support that does 2 main roles, decreased defense and block buffs. MVP. Lady Kimmy is a god for this encounter. We already knew she was a god for Arena. She's now a god for this. Increase speed, increase accuracy, decrease speed, decrease accuracy. The main thing is she does a cleanse and a block buffs at the same time. If you've got Lady Kimmy, again, same thing as Duchess. If you've got her, she's probably straight in one of your teams. It's not a question. She is very good. Now, we've got some 3 other options here. We've got 2 epics, which are Umbral Enchantress. She's 100%. She's pretty good. The reason why I've got her here because there's not that many other champions, but I actually wouldn't really use her unless I had to, because she doesn't really do anything else. She doesn't have any other effects. She doesn't bring anything else to the game. The A3 is a provoke, which is designed for kind of arena or wave content. That is not going to help her. It'll give her an unkillable buff that really doesn't matter. And the A1's just a damage. It doesn't mean anything. So if you're really struggling for block buff options, then you can go with Umbral. She is 100%. That's the good thing about it. And then a pretty regular debuff as well. I would suggest if you are going to use her, you don't use the A3 because you will block yourself out of your own skills. Fenax is a good choice, but he's not 100%, which is a bit frustrating. His A1 would be amazing for this encounter. We've just said, you know, single target damage is the way to go. He's one of the hardest hitting single target champions in the game on an A1, but he is not 100% on his A2 for block buffs. Now I've left Mortu to last because most people are probably thinking, oh, Mortu. Now I know Scratch did a video on this and was like, I'm going to be using my Mortu, and I didn't really think about Mortu until I thought of a combination of Mortu in one of my teams, and he's actually going to be a pretty good option. He's on a 4-turn cooldown when you book him, and it will place the block buffs for 2 turns, but he has got that Peril ability. Peril will nuke anything in Hydra, so that's very much like Shamael. So if you've got like a Shamael paired with a Mortu Macabre, you've got your damage sorted. Those two will probably pick on any head they want to pick on. He also has an A1 heal reduction, so if someone's got a life barrier that's about to go off, you can target them with his A1 and probably stop that life barrier. So it's quite kind of niche and handy. The other category I want to cover is MVPs for the support role. You're going to want to bring an ally protector, and there are quite a number of good options now, recently added, I would say. So the latest one is obviously Kyoku. Kyoku is probably the MVP outside of Krisk of ally protection. She does A3 with a extra turn, so she can keep the ally protection up on a 2-turn duration for 3-turn cooldown essentially. But she also places block damage on herself, which is insane. She basically can take 50% of all the team's damage and just not take it. I think that's possibly the most insane ability I've seen in a very long time. But she also has A1 weaken, and she also has an AoE decrease attack. It has a funky mechanic on HP burn, which might be helpful, but to be honest, you know, until Playroom give us an indicator of who has placed what debuff, how are we meant to know whose decrease attack is on which boss? It's a bit of a strange one. But the fact is an AoE decrease attack providing one of the main core support roles and ally protection, and she can mitigate her own damage, and she's got that passive heal. She is a god for this. If I was looking for a champion, I'd be wanting to pull her next. But there are other good options as well, and some of these options everyone would have got. We've got Vasulf the Grim, recently a fusion, probably one of the best ally protectors, top 3 in the game, along with Tyrant. He's basically the leech version of Tyrant. Tyrant is probably better for this because of the HP burn. We know obviously if you're not dealing with Poison Cloud from a block buffs point of view, you need HP burn. That's where Tyrant would come in really handy. He also has that damage reduction component, which will help your team. But Vasulf is also great. Increased defense and ally protection on one ability with a leech. That's an amazing kit. It doesn't matter that his A1 provokes and doesn't work because the other 2 abilities are what he needs. The other option then for people, which is totally free, is Vizix. Long lauded as one of the worst freebie legendaries, I guess, because it's a void legendary. She's actually very good now. Keeping in mind that we can place decreased speed, it looks like. That means that her AoE decreased speed is going to work. She also has ally protect. The turn meter mechanics won't work necessarily, but if you're struggling for one of these ally protect champions, then she's a great place to turn to, and she will serve you in other parts of the game as well. Nazana is the budget version here. Nazana is a very good choice. She does 3-turn cooldown, 2-turn duration ally protect. She also has a decreased attack on an AoE as well. So she's a great budget option to go to if you haven't got these other options available on the screen. Now the last 3 are probably what I would say are premium options. And the reason why I say a premium, most people, if they've been doing hard Doom Tower, probably are close or have got Urost. Urost would be a god for this, just because he will become quite unkillable with his passive mechanic. And he will help with poisons on some of the heads. Obviously, if you have if they make a rotation where mostly poisons don't work, then he probably falls in priority. But he brings ally protection and strengthen. It's probably outside of not having increased defense, it couldn't get much better for a defensive ability. So I think Urost would be a great option for an ally protector. Krisk, we know, is the king of clan boss. He's not going to change in Hydra, to be honest. He's going to be the same bonkers kit that he's got, you know, increased duration, ally protect, increased defense, increased speed, all the other stuff. If you've got a Krisk, he's going in your team, no question. Urost is a bit of a weird one, just because she kind of places strength on herself. I would say she's basically a lesser version now than Kyoku for PvE, because she does have that A2 which places decreased attack, conditional on the fact that, you know, I would hope the heads are probably going to have more attack than defense. We don't truly know yet. But if they do, then that will mean that she can reliably place decreased attack. For this encounter, that's what I'm assuming. If she doesn't, then she falls really low in priority for me because she's not got what Vasulf would bring, which is an increased defense with the ally protect, or Kyoku, who's bringing that guaranteed AoE decreased attack, non-conditional, and the extra healing. I would even potentially say, does she lose her place to someone like Nazana? That's a bit of a hot topic. But you will want an ally protector, I think, in your team because the team is going to be taking a lot of damage and you need to manage that. I want to do some honorable mentions, and this is kind of like an epic pool of champions that I think that will be very good for this encounter. I think that Thalesia will actually be very good for this encounter because she's got AoE decreased defense, AoE debuff extension, and she's also got Hex built in without having to necessarily dedicate a skill to it in her passive. So if you need something to deal with that mischief head, she can probably keep Hex up on it. And she also then has an A1 debuff spread on hexed target. So you could end up in a scenario where you can just start chucking debuffs around the place very comfortably with her A1. I think she'll be very good. She doesn't take that many books. You could probably even get away with not even booking her to some extent. Vildrax was the epic that we've just had in the fusion. A lot of people may have been like, do I really want to do the fusion with the Christmas fusion coming up? I actually think his kit is not bad. He's probably the best support hex champion we've got. Hellhades did a video on him, and it's mainly because his base stats are decent. He does a debuff extension, which is nice. He takes a ton of books, which is a disappointment. But he's not bad. His passive to me feels a bit wonky. I'd have preferred he just steals 10% of the healing passively rather than it being an all or nothing. But if we need a hex champion, if that head of mischief does prove to be more problematic, I think Vildrax is a great choice to sort of go to for the hex option if you haven't got Thalesia. The other unique honorable mention here is Venomage. Now Venomage is going to be something I'm going to talk about in the team when we look at Mortimer Macabre. But she has got the Geomancer passive of damage reduction, 15%, without necessarily requiring the HP burn on a single target. She can do it with anyone who's got heal reduction. And we just mentioned that heal reduction will disable life barrier. So you can see the value here. You put heal reduction out, you get one benefit. You also get the damage reduction. She will do poisons. She will have a single target decreased defense and a decreased attack if there's a condition. So she may not necessarily be a huge damage dealer if it's all the wrong poison bosses, but just as a pure support champion in terms of reducing the damage you take, she's actually very strong to the extent where she can solo Ice Golem. Stag will probably make a comeback for some people, especially if the champion pool is limited. Stag or Duke, he's still a god in terms of what he does. Not many champions can do a 3-turn cooldown, 2-turn AoE decreased attack and decreased defense. Two primary debuffs we need. Demitha, the queen of clan boss at the moment, the best champion they've released in a while. She can easily be in any of these teams as well. AoE block damage, if you know you're going to take a vengeance hit maybe, probably block that, great, if you can time it right. Her A2 heal is immense. Probably outside of Wither the Crowned, I don't think anyone can heal out as well as she can outside of that A2. You put some buffs up, you put some debuffs on you, that heal is huge. It'll just fully heal everyone. The A1 is a forgotten skill, but Demitha can go into any comp as a support champion, a healer. I think it's great. Mordecai, if HP burn does prove to be needed for that poison cloud, Mordecai can place HP burn AoE. Akoth can do it on an attack, Mordecai can place it, which means he bypasses all the weak hits and all the craziness. So if you've got a Mordecai and he's chilling in your vault, keep him warmed up. Godseeker Iniri, massive heal boost support. Her passive is still very powerful. And then I've got two Hanorach here, but that could easily be Doom Priest. Basically, they do the same thing. You know, remove the debuff as they go. They heal you as they go. So Hanorach does the defense buff and as it hits a bit harder, so it's probably the premium option, but is Void Legendary. But Doom Priest is also an honourable mention. You might have some of these champions or none of these champions, depending on what on your pool. You might have like 5 Duchesses, I don't know. But if you're struggling to find a team, these are some of the champions that can help you get through the mechanics. It's been a long video, but now what I'm going to do is basically give you a breakdown example of some teams that I am thinking about putting together based on what I've just mentioned. Some of them will be based on my account that I've got, but we're going to put them together and see how they all form as a single 6-man unit. So this is the first team that I have put together. Now you will notice in all my teams I've got Inquisitor Shamael. I just personally feel it's much easier for players to access an epic Void champion. Okay, I get that some people will say it's nice to have 3 Shamaels. You will be able to get them much easier than you will be able to get some of the Duchesses of the world. So I think having a Shamael just solves a lot of your problems. Obviously you can go with the Duchess solution, that's not a problem. This is just my recommendations of what I personally think or how I am going to approach this scenario. So in this team I've got Kimmy for block buffs. She obviously does her other buffs as well, but just her main job is block buffs. And we're going to use The Ender Priest Brogni for block debuffs and obviously the increased attack, shield growth. He can also remove the buff off the enemy and remove debuffs off you. I still think he's going to be really strong in this. His passive still works. He's still going to reflect Giant Slay. He's still going to do lots of damage. He's not any different from normal clan boss. We've then got Urost as our main protector, providing strength in AoE and also providing the ally protection. He also will do some poisons passively, which is going to connect to Dark Kale. Now, obviously, some of the bosses cannot take poisons. That's the risk we're going to take. But Dark Kale has a crazy passive where he will basically reduce the crit rate of the Hydra heads. And there's nothing to suggest that the crit rate of the Hydra heads won't match every other boss in the game and be 15%, which means if that poison is on the boss, he will not be able to crit our team. Dark Kale is also there for decreased attack and debuff extension. So the idea here is we want to keep the block buffs up on the enemy at all times. Then we've got Thalessia as the last spot. Thalessia will do AoE decreased defense, Hex debuff on those targets, and she'll start spreading things around if she needs to. She also has the debuff extension as well. So we've got a double debuff extension, block buffs, support, and then Shamael is kind of going to be probably our main damage source here, along with Brogni, and then the passive damage of the poisons where we can do them. That's an example of Team 1. You know, that could be a very high damage, very low damage. We won't know until we see the stats. But in terms of how we manage the effects that we're going to face, that would cover all of the effects. You're blocking most of the debuffs with Brogni. You're blocking all of the buffs pretty much that can be blocked with Kimmy. So this is my second team that I've put together. This is very much a budget option apart from Mortu, I would say. You know, all of these are either a free-to-play kind of fusion, epic, legendary, or are epics. So I mentioned a special relationship between Mortu and another champion. That's with Venom Mage. Now, Venom Mage will apply a heal reduction on an AoE with some poisons. And when she does that, she activates her passive, which reduces the damage your team takes from any enemy under heal reduction by 15%. Mortu Macabre on his A2 has a block buffs ability. However, if he does that on an enemy under heal reduction, he will do that without requiring accuracy. It will become irresistible. So it doesn't matter whether the heads have 600 resistance, he'll be able to place them, which means that you can make him extremely high HP, a bit of defense so he doesn't die too easily, and just do a lot of damage with the Shamael. This team here will probably pump out more single target damage than the previous team. It is a little bit squishier probably, just because of the type of champions we got here. You know, we're not running Brogni. I've put here Scathix. It could easily be Brogni. It could easily be another block debuffs. But just an example, Scathix could go here, places block debuffs, protects you. And then I've got Stag Knight providing the decreased attack and decreased defense. Now, you could easily change this up and kind of go, I'll drop Stag Knight for, say, someone like Thalessia again, and then just change my support role to someone else with a decreased attack. Say, like you've got Kyoku. Kyoku would replace the Sulf. That opens up more freedom in your team to have just a dedicated decreased attack, a debuff extender. Could be Dark Kale, and then you could bring a decreased defense champion here. The Sulf is excellent for this role, one of the better ally protectors, and again, we've got Shamael just to protect us and do some damage. So this is my favourite team that I've put together, and if I had Kyoku, I would build this team probably pretty quickly. You've got Norog for block buffs, unconditional, easy place, awesome. You get the passive that we've been talking about, similar to Venom Mage as well, 15% damage reduction. It does have a weird thing if you haven't got any buffs, but you're probably going to have a buff out. We've then got Kyoku. Kyoku is amazing here because we get the decreased attack and the ally protection, and we know it's a very strong ability. Shamael again is in there for damage, he's in here for the Fearhead. And then I've got Minaya. Now, Minaya, I think, could be very good. Again, this could be Brogni, but I'm just saying Minaya for this team, great. We've got healing, we've got a block debuffs ability, perfect. And then we've got Godseeker Iniri. That's going to amplify the healing for Minaya and also extend the buffs for Martyr. Martyr provides the increased defense buff to go with the team and the counterattack and the single target decreased defense. Most of the bosses, most of the heads will have an AoE in their ability. I think there's only one that doesn't have it. Most of them have it on an A1. So Martyr is going to be able to produce the decreased defense quite regularly. So yeah, this is a good example of a really balanced team. You know, Kyoku is really good here because of the AoE decreased attack. You have everything you need to kind of make it work. The AoE decreased defense is a bit risky, but I think it should be fine. So here's another example as well. As I said, you can mix these up as much as you want. In this one, I'm using Ugo as my block buffs champion, Cardiel as my block debuffs champion, These two champions here will maintain it pretty regularly. They're both 3-turn cooldown, 2-turn duration. For the ally protector, we're using Tyrant, and he's going to do an increased defense and ally protection. And then we have got Dark Hail providing an AoE decrease attack for us. And then we're going to bring in the god that is Lydia for the decreased defense, weaken, and increased speed and strengthen. So this is going to be probably the tankiest team that I've put together. And again, we've got Shamael for damage. So it's not going to maybe do as much damage as the other teams, but it will be tankier. Now I've kind of got this A team that I've put together. This is based on what champions that I've got in my account right now that I would build my number 1 team. And that's probably going to be Norog because he's just straightforward. I could go with Ugo as well, but I think him being defense-based, Ugo being not as high damage, I think it would be better to go with Norog. I'm going to go with Isuga as my ally protector because I need an AoE decrease attack that is regular and reliable. So I will pair that with Martyr's A3 so that they've got enough uptime. I might use Brogni or I might use Manaya. I'm a bit on the fence with it. I kind of like the Manaya and Neri combo for extra healing, but Brogni would I think just be as good. Aneri is going to extend the buffs, and then Martyr is going to be here. She's already built for my Doom Tower. She's pretty good to go for this. She'll be there just applying decreased defense, counterattacks, and hopefully then between that team, that should really nuke it out. So that brings the video to an end. It was a very long video, probably longer than I anticipated. And if you've stuck with me this long, that's really great. I appreciate you watching. I hope the information I provided to you has given you some insights into your own account in terms of what champions you want to prioritize, look into, and start leveling up. Obviously, it's subject to assumptions that we don't have access to the speeds or any of the stats of the boss. The moment we get that data, I will be deep diving in to see what we're facing, the difficulty that we will have. And then I might revisit this video and actually update my sort of initial thoughts with actual thoughts about how we approach it. Hellhades will be doing videos probably on Hydra once he's set up in his new house and off and running. And yeah, we'll be keeping the channel, the guides, the website all up to date with everything related to Hydra. So again, thanks for watching. If you have liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. I will probably be doing another video this week on the patch notes, the unofficial patch notes that I always do when the new patch comes out. I'm sure there'll be new nuggets in the data. Keep an eye out for that. If you want to get an alert, please give the channel a subscribe. And yes, I'll catch you in the next video.